I'm going to start the program by introducing our guests from Strongtown. Norm Van Eeden Petersman is the Director of Membership and Development at Strongtowns and the Member Advocate. Norm has published articles on housing, transportation, faith, and culture, and his writing appears regularly on the Strongtowns site. He is an energetic enthusiast for the work that Strongtowns members do around the world. Norm spent 10 years pastoring churches in Canada as a preacher, teacher, and leader. He's worked in communications and stakeholder outreach for the mayor of Surrey, BC, and the federal minister of health in Ottawa, Ontario. Norm's been a tree planter and construction laborer. He grew up on a dairy farm in Alberta. Today, he coaches soccer, promotes cycling, and advocates for better land use in his community of Delta, British Columbia, as a leader of Deltans for People-Oriented Places. John Pattison is the community builder for Strong Towns. In this role, John has helped local leaders in nearly 200 towns and cities start and run local Strong Towns groups called Local Conversations. He's the author of 2 books, most recently Slow Church, which takes inspiration from slow food and other slow movements to help faith communities reimagine how they live life together in the neighborhood. John is also co-host of The Membership, a podcast inspired by the life and work of Wendell Berry, the Kentucky farmer, writer, and activist. John is especially passionate about the ways neighbors come together as co-creators of their places. This includes the neighborhood's first approach to strengthening communities, which uses small incremental investments to address observed real-life struggles and opportunities in the neighborhood. It also includes radical experiments in intentional living. John and his family co-live with another family in Silverton, Oregon. Right across their property line is an 11-cottage co-housing community founded by friends who are also Strongtown members. We are thrilled to have Norm and John from Strongtowns with us here today. Thank you both for spending some time with us. And we're going to start off with a presentation today, probably take most of the time, and then we will most likely wrap up with audience Q&A. So I'm going to turn it over to Norm and John for the presentation, and then we'll come back for questions afterwards.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe and Kim, and the introductions of all the guests. It's so good to connect with you this morning, and thank you for this opportunity. I want to talk to you about a Strongtown's vision for Los Altos, and this talk also goes by another name, which is the failure of the suburban experiment. That's something pretty jarring to wake you up in the first thing in the morning here. And it is one of those things that we grapple with as a Strongtowns organization, is how do we share a message within our communities of what is possible, but also the real challenges and problems that we face. From the general perspective of sort of a bird's eye view of North America, the challenge that we are facing in our communities, by and large, is that we are dealing either with strangling exclusion or rolling blight. And both of these things are phenomenon that are tightly woven together. And in the Bay Area, as in Vancouver, British Columbia, where I live, we're dealing with strangling exclusion. As prices continue to climb, as resources continue to be stretched, we find ourselves really pinched because there are massive forces that make it really difficult for things to be affordable and manageable for most people. Simultaneously, in many other parts of the country, we're seeing the lack of investment, the struggle to actually adapt, the fact that many rural areas have housing shortages, even though they have ample land and really seemingly no end of opportunities to construct the very thing that the communities need. And so the question that we ask in our neighborhood is always, our neighborhoods are changing. I lead a community group here, and we have to confront various people that are like, I just don't want anything to change. I moved here 35 years ago. I loved it. I bought for this very type of neighborhood. And so don't change anything on me. It's not fair. In fact, who are you to suggest that anything should change? And the response is always, no, our neighborhoods are changing. They're changing every single day. Many of the new amenities and features that people actually enjoy are consequences of those changes. But the challenge is, will our neighborhoods become more exclusive and expensive? Because that's the course that we're on. a country club for the wealthy, or will they become more inclusive and diverse through a rather modest amount of adjustments to our current building practices, adjustments to the way that we view the approach of adding more investment within our neighborhoods? And so this is really core to what Strong Towns is about as a movement, is to try to say, how do we create communities that are safe, livable, and inviting, and allow everyone to live a good life in a prospering place? One of the challenges that we have in the North American landscape as a consequence of changes to the way that we built out cities and towns and villages after World War II is that we've lost sight of what it is to build within complex systems. Complex systems, and learning a lot from software engineering and other sort of worlds like this, as well as the observation of biological organisms and systems, have within them the means of correction that bring you up and down through the equilibrium zone with quite a bit of frequency. This allows for small failures to occur that give rise to new successes, new opportunities. But one of the challenges is that by policy, our leaders have said, hey, let's figure out a way to never have failures, which, as we're seeing with Boeing, as we're seeing with many other companies, results in only having spectacular failures, significant heightened failures that cause a lot of harm. And so one of the core principles that Strong Towns urges every community to consider is, how do we have an approach that allows for adaptation, for mitigation of ongoing pressures as early as they come up? This is most evident in the housing shortage that we're facing. We have known for a long time that we were not building enough homes, and yet we made it nearly impossible to build the types of housing at the levels of affordability that we need in order to meet these demands. And the suburban experiment, that is building entire communities, building them all at once and out to a finished state, that suburban experiment is marked by a policy commitment as well as a cultural commitment to resistance to change, exclusion by class, and in many, many, many places across the country, mandatory car ownership. And we'll touch on just the impacts of this in a moment. Well, one of the things that we always want to stress is that the suburban experiment, leaving many neighborhoods entirely as they are and not permitting new investment to allow for the gradual iteration of what that neighborhood can be. It's gradual thickening, it's gradual maturing into a healthier and sometimes more vertical neighborhood. To not allow that to happen is akin to leaving our communities in a state of perpetual adolescence. We allow them to be birthed. We allow them to basically find their feet. The road gets paved. All of the houses are built in. And then we say, now you need to stay this way. Now you need to stay this way. You won't gain through wisdom and the accumulation of greater uses and greater capacity to serve one's needs. The introduction of retail stores on the corner or even within neighborhoods. All of these types of things have actually been limited because of the assumption of auto dominance and dependency, and the turning around of many plans and saying, this doesn't meet our standards. This doesn't meet our plans. This should go elsewhere because we don't want it in our neighborhood. And the challenge of this is that it has resulted in many places not being allowed to grow up. Not 18-story towers, 30-story towers, but just 2, 3, 4-story structures, a little bit more tightly compacted. We have entire subdivisions that can now no longer by law be subdivided. Well, why not? What if we allow many of these things to take place is going to be so critical. This is an image out of Delta, British Columbia, my community. This is a neighborhood street that looks virtually identical to what it is today, except that now they've built in the field just behind there. This is an example. This was built in the 1970s, and yet you walk down the street and you'll see the exact same image of the same homes in the same situation, no new addition of uses, and the real struggles that are there. And so this is a commitment that entire neighborhoods would be built all at once and to a finished state. The trouble of this is that when we do not allow for greater opportunities for investment and continuing to capture private wealth within our places, we load our cities up with significant costs, massive liabilities. In my city, we did a calculation of every $1 of municipal investment that my city has in their so-called assets. So that's our streets, our sewers, our sewage treatment plants, our community centers, our fire halls, all of the different things that our city owns and operates, and out of the public purse is obligated to repair, to maintain, to keep in good shape. For every $1 of municipal investment, there is about $3 in private investment, which makes it really difficult to draw from the private realm enough funds to be able to subsidize or care for and provide for the work that's taking place within the public community. And I understand in Los Altos, you're giving consideration to new upgrades of public facilities. And one of the things that Strong Towns always urges every community leader to consider is, do you have the sufficient private base of wealth from which to draw a fraction of that through taxation, through shared obligation, in order to cover your costs as a community? And one of the core programs that Strong Towns is urging communities to look at is to have safe and productive streets. And we'll touch on what a productive street looks like. You have them in your community. They're wonderful and capable of providing that range of private wealth that really generates then the necessary tax base and capacity to cover various private interests as well. One of the examples, this is a little bit, it's not too far from Los Altos, but a significantly different context. But I want to illustrate what the pattern of land use looks like that is all around you. Your community is interesting because of its being constrained by two major freeways and being in a fairly landlocked area. But even then, back in the day when the original community was being developed, you can see many of the same things that hold here. This is an example of the work to develop the city of Fresno. And in this period of time, we begin to see as the community grows, and all of a sudden it begins to just grow. And yet the population, if you were to map out the population growth of Fresno, it would have been much more stable compared to the increase in the size of the land area of the community. And the challenge, the difficulty of this, is that it loads up the community with a great deal of infrastructure responsibilities without the underlying capacity to be able to cover these needs, which is why so many of our communities are facing significant structural deficits, long-term shortfalls in funding, why every public works director or asset manager in your community has gray hair and has pulled out most of it, because there's never enough money for the long-range repair and replacement of what is taking place in our communities. And so this is, I gave the speech just a little bit ago in Medford, Oregon, but made the point here that we have traded a robust incremental approach for a complicated and fragile pattern of suburban style development. If we had a longer time, it'd take some time to really begin to lay this out. But this is for us what we see when we see neighborhoods being built out in a suburban style as opposed to a more traditional neighborhood style. With the expectations in these suburbs of water, all of the services being provided, with the political demand and power to say we want low taxes per acre, but equal services. Back in the day, our communities all across the United States and Canada would grow like this. You would have an initial bet on an opportunity. There would be a confluence of rivers or a trade route that would pass through. And so there would be some small structures that were put up. But what was always assumed is that if the place took hold, if there was some success there, that greater iterations or the next increment of growth would take place. And we see this in this frontier town in Minnesota, but just a few years later, a couple of decades later, you've got big imposing structures. You've got the gathering of wealth. As you see a little bit further down the street, you see also the areas that would be next up for development, for opportunity. There was a gradual thickening and maturing of the neighborhood and the community. By 1930, this place was even more built out. And this was just the normal pattern of what communities really and cities have done throughout history, all across human habitat or human civilization. When resources are available, we begin to concentrate, we begin to cluster, and in doing so, we benefit from having this together. Similarly, this was in Oregon as they continued to do the same pattern. And I'm sure if we had time, we could look at the slides in Los Altos and see many of those things. And here's an example out of Lafayette, Louisiana, where we did a survey of all of the costs associated with their pattern of development. In 1949, with a population of 33,000, it required 5 feet of pipe per person to service that area, as well as 2.4 hydrants for 1,000 people. By 2015, there was a 3.5 times increase in population, but a 10 times increase in the sewage treatment required, and a 21 times increase in the amount of water piping necessary in order to provide coverage to these expansive neighborhoods. That's not efficient. If you have a small tax base and you have added way more responsibilities to that base, a lot of things are going to go unpaid. And this has serious implications for the future. That the mechanisms of growth that we have become accustomed to are waning. Local governments are being forced to absorb the local costs of the current development pattern. And the challenge is to fix this problem. We can't do this in the current development pattern without large tax increases or large cuts in service, which is where we say there's always an alternative. And the alternative is to adjust and change our development pattern. To this point, I want to ask you to consider why you might do such a thing. This is 200 Main Street, Satura Cakes in Los Altos, on a 0.6 acre site, so a very efficient use of the land within a lovely area, is valued at an assessed value of $5.6 million on a per acre basis. So if you take the value, it's $336,000 for the actual property. But if you divide that by the portion of land that it is taking up, you get by 0.6 acres, you get $5.6 million. This is sort of like miles per gallon in a vehicle. We don't compare a Ford truck and a Mazda Miata and say, well, the Ford truck must be just better on gas because it can drive a further distance with a large tank. No, we compare them equally, and we see the relative efficiency of each of these buildings, each of these building types. Just up the street on State Street, a two-story structure comes in at 0.6 acres, is valued at $17.6 million per acre. So we see just by changing slightly the development pattern, and thickening it up, allowing it to mature a little bit more. Notice it's another restaurant, a good place for a good community, and all of a sudden you see significantly more value there. Now we go over just a slightly larger site, 0.16 acres, but it's built in the same style, and it's worth $25.7 million per acre. Notice these are all very small sites, and you've got hundreds of these in your downtown. But then if we begin to change the development pattern, we go from a pattern that has the capacity to hold $25.7 million on per acre in that area, down to $13.8 million on a more suburban style. This is on San Antonio Drive, 0.38 acre site. So not that large of a site, but notice the change in the style of the development and the consequence in the drop of the thing. But here you have, I had to actually work hard to find your shopping centers and big malls because I noticed that most of it is outside of your community, which helps your community, is actually going to cause some challenges for Mountain View and other places. But 600 Foothill Expressway it's not a 0.6 acre site, it's a 6.6 acre site, is worth a comparable $2.3 million per acre. And so the question is, how do we recover from such a drop in financial productivity? If you go the one way, that is, the newer things that we've been building have a 12 times penalty compared to the older things that we were building. I did this analysis in one small community near me, and their old, like really run down downtown area was 9 times as financially productive and contributing 9 times as much property tax per acre as the brand new big box store. And yet that big box store was at the beginning of its life cycle, was at, in a sense, the highest point of its value, and would only begin to decline. And yet it was already significantly underwater in comparison with those things that hold their value and provide lasting benefit. Like I said, I gave this talk in Medford just recently. I was able to do a bit more analysis there where I looked at their downtown and I said, look at all of these relative, for them, these high land values, $8.8 million, $4.4 million, and compared it to the big box center that they had, which is out a smaller site, but taking up this much land, 14 acres worth of land at 0.96. And the question there was, how can we have something that's as productive or capable of building that lasting value within the community? As well, from the public purse, which one requires the highway interchange to survive? Which one is more adaptable and resilient? And so as you take steps to make your community more vibrant by adding more transportation options within your community, allowing people to walk within your community, you will see those property values in that early section that I showed you, they will continue to grow. And as they grow, it creates that greater capacity to cover the core of our needs. And this was an older man from Wisconsin who asked me, he said, hey, what is going on with Strong Towns? Because you're saying something that I've actually been feeling for a long time. And he said, one of the things I've noticed is that we've lost sight of what it takes to build enduring prosperity. to build enduring prosperity. And with that, I want to pass it over to my colleague, John, who's going to touch on what are some of the things that we can do to build enduring prosperity, or at least to relearn the practices of doing so.
Yes, thanks, Norm. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. One of the things that I want to make clear, excuse me, is that we at Strong Towns, we are here because we want to help communities and advocates think differently about building community prosperity and financial resilience. One of the questions that we're often asked is, do you do consulting? Or do you have model codes that you can give our city? Or do you have model legislations that we can introduce? And the answer is that we don't. Like we have a kind of a 2-year coaching program that we offer, but the reason we don't do consulting or offer model codes or doing any of these things is because we believe that local context is so very important. City leaders, city advocates like you have choices to make every single day. And so what we want to offer is kind of this new way of thinking about those choices and evaluating those choices that will help your city on its journey to lasting strength and prosperity, both now and for future generations. And so I'm going to go through a couple of principles that we encourage communities to consider. These are phrased as recommendations, even as call to actions, but they're so very different than the status quo approach that I'm hoping you can think of them as much as shifts in mindset as much as anything else. What we recommend is that at Strong Towns is that communities should spend about 90 to 95% of their public investments on routine maintenance, with the priority going to sort of the most financially productive places in the community, the financial engines of your community. And then the other 5 to 10% is dedicated to low risk, high return small bets. In the first Strong Towns book, the founder and president of Strong Towns, Chuck Marone, compared this allocation of public investments to the barbell investment strategy of Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Taleb is sometimes call him, he's an investor, a philosopher, a statistician. We sometimes describe him as kind of one of the patron saints of Strong Towns thinking. I especially recommend his book Anti-Fragile. But Taleb is also an investor, and he says that a private investor who is following the barbell strategy will dedicate the vast majority of their portfolio to the safest investments. This is going to protect them from catastrophic loss, while all but ensuring that they're going to make at least a little money back. But then the rest of that portfolio, say about 10%, is invested in riskier but high returning investments. And so you're never going to lose more than 10%, but you're also exposed to this massive upside. It's a way for you to, as an investor, and in this analogy for you as a city, to be both defensive and aggressive at the same time. So what the barbell strategy looks like for communities is that about 90% of public investments will go towards maintenance and 5 to 10% will go towards these little bets. And before I talk about the little bets, I kind of want to say a few words on behalf of maintenance. Back in 2019, I remember Chuck wrote an article, and I think the title was something like, if we are not going to maintain what we already have, then why are we going to build anything new? We need to change our attitudes towards maintenance. Maintenance may seem unsexy, but maintenance is actually beautiful. The architect Steve Muzan said that we maintain what we love. And that's so true. I'm a writer. I love etymology. I looked up the etymology of the word maintain, and it literally means to hold in one's hand. We maintain what we love. We maintain our house because we love it. We maintain our garden because we love seeing beautiful things grow, and we love eating a fresh tomato right off the vine. We maintain our relationships because we love our spouse or a partner. And I think the flip side of that is also true, that we love what we maintain. If you think about your neighbor who's out there like washing and waxing his 57 Chevy every other weekend, do you think that he loves that car more or less for all of the hours that he has spent keeping it running and keeping it looking beautiful? One of the most successful neighborhood revitalization programs that we've seen at Strong Towns is out of Oswego, New York. It's this group called the Oswego Renaissance Association, and what they do is they offer small matching grants to neighbors who want to collaboratively improve the exterior of their neighborhood. These are neighborhoods that have been struggling. There's been a sense of defeat. This is a kind of a Rust Belt city who has seen better days. And if you think of a neighborhood as kind of a mutually held stock, these are neighborhoods that have had a bank run on community confidence. And so what these matching grants do, equivalent to about $1,000 per household per matching grant, is it unlocks confidence in the neighborhood and it gets neighbors working together often for the first time. A neighborhood that's been in decline and suffering from disinvestment all of a sudden has become a place worth staying, a place worth loving, a place worth a place worth investing in. These small grants, which is essentially maintenance, like what they do is they unleash the financial and social capital that have been pushed to the sidelines in these declining neighborhoods. Um, for towns and cities, maintenance just makes good financial sense too. Norm was talking about Lafayette earlier. This is the result of a study that we did with our friends at Urban 3. They're a financial analytics firm based in Asheville, North Carolina. And what Urban 3 does is they will go into communities and they will kind of map the financial productivity of a place. They'll look parcel by parcel by parcel. This particular map, as I said, out of Lafayette, Louisiana, everything that is green is financially productive. It is generating more revenues for the city than it costs to maintain and take care of and like in time replace the infrastructure for each of these parcels. And everything that is red is revenue negative. And the higher the block goes, either the further it goes into that financial productivity or financial negativity. The spike of green in the middle represents a mixed use development that's built it's a new development, but it's built according to a traditional sort of pre-World War II development pattern that brings commercial and residential together, has narrower streets and so on. And then you have the downtown in green, and to the east of that are the older pre-World War II neighborhoods. In Lafayette, these houses are smaller. The neighborhoods are unfortunately kind of run down. The people who live there are more likely to have lower incomes. And still, like in terms of revenue to the city, these neighborhoods are still financially productive. So what is all of that red surrounding it? All of the part of the city that is revenue negative in Lafayette and in many places, these are the wealthier neighborhoods that are built according to the suburban development pattern that Norm described. These are single family only neighborhoods with big lots and wide sweeping streets. These are the big box stores. And when you think about this in terms of maintenance, unfortunately, in many places, it's the lower income neighborhoods that are more likely to get the investment dollars. And what that means in Lafayette is that the neighborhood that is like less likely to get those maintenance dollars is actually one of the financial engines of the community. So thinking in this way is going to change even how we how we decide like where to invest our precious maintenance dollars. Like what is going to make our town run? And so we've talked about kind of the 90%, but what about the other 5 to 10% of the barbell strategy? At Strong Towns, we say that cities are playing an infinite game. Their goal is to survive. The problem is that the conventional approach to public investments exposes our cities to loss after loss after loss. The attitude is essentially go new and go big or go home. And we need a different way. And so we offer kind of this approach as a different way. What this does is it's going to shift the focus from building more to making better use of what we already have. Instead of one giant leap forward that may end up being a giant leap backwards, we're going to take a series of rapid and comparatively small actions that's designed to improve the quality of life now, increase pride of place, and identify the successful strategies that are worthy of greater investment. Step one is to humbly observe where people in your community struggle. Again, I'm a writer. I love etymology. The word humble or humility comes from the word humus, which means ground. And so to humbly observe where people in their community are struggling probably is less likely to happen in a comfortable office somewhere. We need to be out in the community, walking a mile in other people's shoes and seeing where they struggle. There's a story I heard once about Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it's possible, it may be apocryphal, but I love it. It's a good example. I heard it from a journalist named Kevin Williamson. And the story goes that when Eisenhower was the president of Columbia University, they needed to put in some sidewalks for students. And so he had two groups of architects and planners who came in to kind of make their proposal of where these sidewalks should go. And one group said it should go here, another group said it should go over here. And Eisenhower said, you know what we're going to do? Like we're not going to do anything for a year. We're going to let students trample on the grass for the next year, and then we're going to put the sidewalks where they have trampled, like what was sometimes called like desire paths. And it turns out that both of those original groups of planners and architects were wrong. All right, well, the point is just that they've trampled somewhere different than what the architects and planners had in mind. And so that's where they built the sidewalks. Like both of those original kind of like theoretical approaches was wrong. And when they met students where they're at, they were able to make a sidewalk that was going to meet people. Step two is to ask the question, what's the next smallest thing that we can do right now to address the struggle? What materials do we have on hand? What skills do we have in our community? What experience do we have on hand to improve this situation right now? And what you have on hand may be hay bales and duct tape and bollards, and that is perfectly acceptable. There have been groups like the Mike Leiden and Anthony Garcia at Street Plans or the Better Block Foundation that have shown cities that you can do a lot with these sort of relatively small demonstration projects that will make your town a better, safer, more livable, and more economically productive. Step three is to do the thing that you identified, do that thing and do it right now. Don't wait. Don't commission a study necessarily. Don't wait for 6 months until you get a grant. Just go out and do it. This is, I think, something that we have learned from Silicon Valley, that top-down thinking tends to be orderly but dumb, whereas bottom-up thinking tends to be chaotic but smart. What we're trying to do with this process is we're not trying to fix this problem for all time. We probably don't know enough yet, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to tap into that chaotic but smart bottom-up energy, and then we're trying to iterate our way towards the solutions that are worthy of we're making small bets. Now they're going to be worthy of the higher bets, the larger bets. Because if the small bet doesn't work, that's okay. You probably have lost nothing, and you've probably learned a lot. And then step four is to repeat this process again and again. Let's quickly tell a story of one example. This is one of our local groups in Charlotte, North Carolina. They went on a walk as a local group, humbly observing where people were struggling around them. And what they noticed was that in many of the poorest neighborhoods in Charlotte, even the bus stops didn't offer even a modicum of comfort and safety for the people who are using public transit. So they said, step two, what's the next smallest thing that we can do to address this struggle right now? And what they decided that they can do is we'll build a bus bench. They pulled together $100 of their own money. I think they used a recycled, like an old, like discarded church pew, and they improved it and they made it look nice and they installed it and they said, let's wait and see if anybody uses the bus bench, if the city takes it away, or if anybody steals it. And so they installed it. They kind of watched. Not only did people use it, but they seemed grateful for it. The city didn't take it away, and nobody stole it. And so they built a few more and a few more and a few more. Last I heard, they have built, I think, around 90 bus benches around the city of Charlotte. And they did a GoFundMe, I think raised $6,000 to pay for the rest of them. And what I love about this story, in part, not only are they solving this problem right now and not waiting, well, when the Regional Transit Authority got together and was trying to make a decision about whether or not it should spend its own money to improve bus stops, they cited the Charlotte Urbanist campaign as proof of concept. If we do this, we have seen that people will use it, that people will be grateful. And so I just think this is a powerful 4-step process. When our local groups kind of don't know what to do to get started, I almost always say, go on a walk together as a group with this in mind. Another thing that cities can be doing is to lower the bar of entry. Cities should do what they can to lower the bar of entry to home ownership. Small homes like the ones seen here, like these are the building blocks of prosperity. And yet, in many places like today, homes and like this and lots this small are illegal to build. Since time immemorial, there's been a ladder of home ownership. Someone who is renting wants to buy their first home. And in the past, they would have looked for a starter home like the one that we just saw, something really small, something that's just right for themselves or for their small family. And then as the family grows and as they're able to accumulate some more capital, maybe they want to upgrade to a larger place. But one of the problems with today's market is that we have effectively removed the lower rungs on the housing ladder. Starter homes are nearly extinct. Between 2002 and 2022, the share of new homes that are priced under $300,000 has dropped from 90% to 10%. As recently as 2015, that was at 50%. Some of this is inflation, but some of this is that we have removed these bottom rungs. We've made it harder for people to build smaller houses, let alone buy smaller houses. And this is concerning not only for people who want to climb the ladder of home ownership, but for those who want to climb down. Older folks say, and empty nesters who want to downsize are left with far fewer options, and the options that they do have in order to downsize will often take them outside of the neighborhood that they've been in for years because the neighborhood only has one kind of house. We also need to lower the bar for commercial. Towns and cities often compete with one another to kind of land a big prize. It's kind of like economic big game hunting. They're using tax breaks and other incentives to lure employers who promise to bring in a bunch of new jobs to their community. And this temptation is understandable, chasing after this new jobs and new growth, but it can unfortunately lead towards and kind of like a race to the bottom. And it can also tempt cities to what we call chase smokestacks by expanding infrastructure and subsidizing new developments in the hopes that if we build it, they will come. And the conventional approach, if it's like big game hunting, the strong towns approach is more like economic gardening. The conventional approach is how do we lure one employer here with 50 jobs? The strong towns approach is how do we help 50 existing businesses add one new job each? The strong towns approach is how do we create an environment that promotes job creation? And we think that if you build a strong town according to these principles, that people will will kind of be beating down the door in order to move to your place. The strong towns approach also it talks about resisting the burdens on existing businesses. And so when some of our recommendations for lowering the bar of entry include don't require parking. This is a costly and unnecessary burden on small businesses. It's also a competitive advantage for large out-of-town rivals who can afford to build and maintain huge half-empty parking lots. We encourage communities to prioritize walking and biking, which generally advantages local businesses. Lower the bar of entry for people who want to use existing buildings. Don't throw the code book at them all at once. Like, don't require them to right away to sort of pay all of that money to get an existing space kind of up to code, to modern code standards. Let them get their feet underneath them first. Waive home occupation requirements. This is something that should be like close to the hearts of all you folks in Silicon Valley. Like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs would not have been able to start their multi-billion-dollar businesses in their garages today, not with the zoning restrictions found in most cities. And then finally, like use pop-up commercial spaces. That's this example in front of you here from Muskegon, Michigan. Muskegon, a few years back, their downtown was really struggling. A lot of their storefronts were empty, and there was a big swath of vacant land kind of leading into the downtown, into the commercial district, which made it less walkable and less vibrant. And so what Muskegon did was it hired a builder to construct 12 small chalets along that vacant strip leading into downtown. And these are, very cute, low-cost buildings that allowed entrepreneurs in Muskegon to kind of test and grow their businesses before deciding on getting into kind of like one of the main storefronts. These chalets they're always full. And the downtown is at almost completely 100% occupancy. It has revitalized the downtown. And going back to small bets, the money for these 12 chalets, like that was donated money. And so it didn't cost the city anything. When the city discovered what a good investment this was, then they began to devote some of their own finances and some of their own public money to building more. I'm going to kind of go quickly now through the rest of these so we have plenty of time for Q&A. One is another recommendation is to embrace ADUs. This is a very basic way to increase housing options. If your town makes it challenging or impossible to build something like this, you're missing out on an important opportunity. And even places where ADUs are allowed, they often folks who want to put an ADU in their backyard often have to run through a lot of fine print obstacles, including a complicated permitting process, minimum lot requirements, parking mandates, owner occupancy requirements, and certain design constraints. It's not enough to just allow ADUs. You can encourage them by addressing these issues. And we've even seen in some cities where they will create a kind of a roster of pre-approved ADU plans. So it's really easy for people to want to create an ADU to actually do that. Another recommendation is to allow commercial and residential areas. This is a time-tested principle of city building. Now by keeping residential and commercial areas separate, what used to be a 5-minute walk to the corner store may now be a 20-minute round-trip drive to a grocery store to get a carton of milk. One of my favorite examples of this is something called an accessory commercial unit. We just talked about ADUs. An ACU is similar. If ADUs go by granny flats, sometimes called granny flats, one of our writers says that an accessory commercial unit is like a granny flat, but granny also gets to sell homemade jam and baked goods out of the front half of her suite. That is an arrangement, an ancient arrangement that is illegal in most places today. Another recommendation is to lower minimum lot sizes. Studies have shown that minimum lot sizes drive up housing costs. The cost of land is a major driver in the cost of a house, and this leads to not only higher prices but also to that making housing shortages worse. So standard minimum lot size requirements should be such that they will encourage infill development rather than pushing growth to the edges of the city, where the land may be cheaper to acquire on the front end, but the cost of adding and maintaining and replacing infrastructure is going to be higher. And finally, our final recommendation is to slow the cars. A strong town, it has streets that are both safe and financially productive. As strong towns, we make a very clear distinction between what is a street and what is a road. A street is a place for building community wealth. It's a place where people are interacting with businesses and with homes. A road is a high-speed connection between two places. Roads and streets both tend to be quite safe. Even the high-speed roads tend to be quite safe. We know how to design roads in order to be safe, even at high speeds. The problem is that one of the dominant features of the suburban development pattern is what we call a strode. We describe a strode as the futon of transportation. If a futon tries to be both a couch and a sofa, a couch and a bed, and ends up doing both of them badly, a strode tries to be both a street and a road and does both of them very, very badly. It tries to be wide in order to move cars efficiently. And yet, because of the frequent stop signs, because of all of the different driveways and all of the complexity that we've introduced, it ends up being not a very efficient way of moving cars. That's where a lot of congestion is. In addition, we've tried to make them places of productive wealth, and so you have a lot of businesses there. But because they're set so far back, because they're all of the parking requirements, all of these things, the infrastructure is so expensive to maintain and replace that they end up not being financially productive. And if you were to look, I would imagine, at a heat map of I don't know if this is true in Los Altos, but almost everywhere else, like if you were to look at a heat map of where the most fatal and traumatic crashes have happened, they're almost always on a strode. And so our recommendation is If you have a street in your community, make the decision as a community, do we want this to be a street or a road? And then redesign it for those purposes. The last thing that I'll mention is that we are a nonprofit media advocacy organization. We publish between 12 and 15 articles per week. We have 3 weekly podcasts. We have over a dozen free ebooks, and everything that we publish is published under a Creative Commons license. And so at this point, we have an archive of 9,000 articles. We have a YouTube channel now that's over 100,000 subscribers. If you have a question about how to build and grow your city productively, chances are we have created a resource around it. If you can't find what you're looking for, let Norm and me know, and we will try to find something that's going to be a best fit for you. And with that, I have no idea what the time is. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I put my watch in my pocket and I turned off my phone. So I don't know where we're at, but hopefully there's plenty of time for Q&A.
No, you're good. We're at 9:24. So super helpful presentation, lots of food for thought, and number of issues that we have been grappling with and continue to grapple with. So thank you for sharing that. We're going to open it up for questions from the attendees today. So please raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you. Just remember, 1 question per person and no speeches, please. So I'm not seeing any hands so far. I might do our announcements while people think about their questions. Why don't I do that? So just for people who might need to leave right at 9:30, we'll keep going if there are questions. But our next meeting is on Friday, May 3rd from 8:30 to 9:30. Please join us for a discussion entitled Building a Connected Community, Skills Building Workshop with Malka Ranjana Capel of Civity. Also on May 3rd is the annual Los Altos Mountain View Community Foundation annual policy convening at 11:30 a.m. at the Mountain View Community Center. Please go to lamvcf.org if you'd like more information on that. If you'd like to be on the LACC mailing list, please send an email to info@losaltoscommunitycoalition.org. This email should be posted in the chat. And big thank you, as always, to the Los Altos Mountain View Community Foundation for providing LACC with financial and in-kind support. So I see Anne has a question. Go ahead, Anne.
A problem that we see in California with Prop 13 is we have these strip malls. They obviously have businesses in them, old strip malls. We would like to develop them for higher density, for higher capacity, but while still keeping that kind of small business. But the problem is it costs so much to develop it that the rents would have to be so high that the businesses that we would like to keep can't afford to stay there. So how should we think about that? How should we think about that problem? Because I think it's probably a problem all across California. It's definitely a problem here that we like these small businesses, but we also want redevelopment, and it doesn't seem like they can coexist.
It's a great question and really important. And there's several threads to it. The first is that parking requirements are typically one of the biggest accelerators of the size of any project, because the cost per space is reduced on a proportional basis the larger that your project is, which is why your 5/1s, for example, can justify underground parking, or in my area, we have to have above ground parking. And so that is definitely one of the things that the inefficiency of providing 3 spaces or 10 spaces on a small lot makes it really challenging, because you still need the turn lanes, you still need the ability to get the car under the garage, and there's a lot of wasted space in addition to the space where the vehicles actually sit. In many places, those parking requirements are outdated and really not fit for purpose. And so that's one of the first pieces. The next part of it is that there are many things that the city can do to identify and even add as part of the mix for mixed use retail, the favoring of small units. Because if you can bring your per square foot cost, the amount of square footage down, even if the square footage cost is higher in order for that construction to occur, we may not be in the state where a thrift store has a large footprint, but instead is on much more modest footprint or a two-story structure in that sort of a way. We put a lot of barriers in the way of, say, a two-story structure, like in the old days with department stores where there would be 3, 4, 5 stories of the same store in a fairly narrow sort of passageway with one elevator once those were being introduced. And so those are the ideas that if you can create bays, and then you can also, we were in Norman, Oklahoma, where through their form-based code, they've really been encouraging local development on their main street. And they've said some of the ground floor units can be used for residential, but they need to have the ability to convert into commercial or retail later, because a lot of the big builders will come in, or even smaller builders, and they say, there's no proof that I could get a retail business to thrive here. But then a short while later, someone comes along and says, man, I wish I could start a coffee shop right here. And that is that convertibility of the ground floor that actually activates the ground floor, because a lot of our ground floor residential is actually buffered from the street, which makes it a poor sort of street front contributor, unless you're getting front porches and sort of that feel of lots of dynamic engagement. The best thing you can do is be preserving and preparing for the conversion of those units into retail. And then the last piece is the encouragement of a policy or a framework of saying, like, no assembly required. That instead of making it that every project only proceeds if they've assembled 8 adjacent properties, that instead the city can do a lot of things with smaller builders to say, what would it take for you to take one structure and maybe add an extra story or a second story, or just deepen it, or add, for if you have alleys, to be able to provide alley access for some of your retail. All of a sudden you can create a really interesting sort of alley experience if you have created the conditions that the building is allowed to be divided front and back, and you know, work within your building code and your fire standards. But there's a lot of things that if we can, if I know that I can get my small business going in a 500 square foot unit, we've seen this in our city. The builder very consciously said, we're going to have 300 people living upstairs. We want not just a bank and a pharmacy. We want, 18 different things. So there's going to be room, they're like a game store and a coffee shop and a few other things. They actually, for the purpose of selling more, increasing the rates of their properties, have actually identified that small scale retail is going to be a lot more valuable to them than the leasing it all to one big anchor tenant. So that's definitely part of the challenge. The other thing that you have is we have a Filipino market in Vancouver that was right adjacent to the SkyTrain station at Joyce Station. And that Filipino market was in an old building, and that building was up for redevelopment. They looked around everywhere in their area because the church was there for the Filipino Catholic community, all of the seniors facilities that spoke Filipino, a whole bunch of these things. So all of the people reasons to remain in the area were so clear. All of the surrounding adjacent neighborhood homes were not available. And yet, if you go into many of our older communities, your bankers, your lawyers, your doctors are all in houses right in your commercial area. Your retail area sees that conversion of the first floor. And so the strict division of residential, commercial, or residential retail is actually one of the things that really cripples small business, because when the Filipino market got the notice they had to vacate, they couldn't say, we will rent your ground floor next door. We'll bring it up to code. And now we've got a new hub. And if we have to expand, we buy, we make arrangements for the next house or whatever that looks like. Instead, they got moved to an old industrial area and their business died. And the Filipino community lost that as a gem and a resource for them. And so it may feel like a big disruption to have the house next to you become a doctor's office or become a small business or a record store or whatever that looks like, but it's actually just so normal, so commonplace. You go down to Mexico and you'll see flower shops that have in the back a barber shop, and in the upstairs you'll see a thrift store, and above that is where people live. That's the traditional development pattern, just very normal. And we can have certain standards for what we want the building to function like. Staircases shouldn't end abruptly and people plummet. But other than that, we should be permissive of those types of adaptations.
I also put an article in the chat that I think would be interesting for most most folks, it's written by our former colleague Daniel Harrigus, with whom Chuck's new housing book. He co-wrote Chuck's new housing book, which comes out next week. Daniel recently was hired as the policy director of the Parking Reform Network, but he wrote an article back in 2019 about the distortions that Prop 13 has on commercial and residential spaces, and how to begin sort of what he acknowledges is kind of the long work of repairing those distortions. Specifically, he talks about the concept of via negativa, or the negative way, or the way of negation, where you're actually like, if you're going to do this long work of restoring this economic ecosystem, one of the best things that you can do is sort of begin like sort of like removing those things that are keeping it kind of plugged up, one at a time. And so, yeah, highly recommended. Freddie.
Sorry, I always forget to unmute. I think one of the issues that we need to address is transportation. Everybody talks about let's get rid of cars. That way we don't need parking places. But we have a real problem with transportation opportunities. When you look at low-income housing, for example, people who have 2 or 3 jobs need cars because they need to get to these 2 or 3 jobs, and they can't rely on public transportation because we have, in my opinion, having lived on the East Coast where we had much better public transportation, our public transportation is not wonderful. So when you talk about having a doctor's office next door, my immediate thought, and how that's just fine for the neighbors, I'm sure many of us on this call have been to Altos Oaks, where it was a residential area and it became half of the street, or maybe more, is all doctors and dentists' office.
Freddie, I need you to ask your question, okay?
Okay, so that I would not want to live on that street, is what I'm saying. How do you accomplish all of your goals when really public transportation is not a city issue, and it is, to me, the obstacle that you must overcome that? How do you do that in order to make all of these things that you're aspiring to work?
So the first layer of it is to remove the instinctive, immediate addressing of every need of the person in the automobile at the expense of the broader sort of community consideration. So where, for example, in Idaho Springs, Colorado, they said, hey, all of our cross streets, we're going to leave as vehicular routes, but our main street running parallel for several blocks is going to become a pedestrian only area. It didn't remove any vehicle access. It may have contributed a little bit to slowing down within the area, and yet didn't remove any access to the highways, where the person that you've mentioned in low-income housing that's driving out to a job is likely using the highway in order to be able to access their workplaces. And so within the core of your areas, between the freeways, you have a lot of opportunities to begin to address those circumstances that allow for people to meet many of their basic needs through the opening up of new opportunities for that type of retail, that type of activity in those places. The flip side of it is that your area is not auto dependent, because there are many people that are dependent upon other means of transportation. You have alternatives, you have, many things within reach. And so the consideration of there are many people that are lower income and require the vehicle in order to be able to access their workplace and their cultural opportunities and things like this. But the truth is, there's many more lower income family members and others that don't have access to the vehicle. And so one of the ways to address that is to say, what is the next smallest thing that we can do to address their struggle? So if there is a poor process for someone to walk on foot to be able to access a core service, think of your neighborhood schools, for example, as a great opportunity to improve the conditions so that many parents feel like it's very acceptable and safe for their children to walk to school or to be walked to school. One of the considerations we always say too is to help the next generation consider things like I love the policy of the 5-minute walk, that parents are encouraged, if you are driving your child to school, park 5 minutes away, relieving much of the congestion around the school, and make that a 5-minute like mental health like check-in opportunity with your child. Will it add more to people's already hectic days? Yes. Will it be good for them? Probably. And so there's those considerations. But then the other part of it is that when you begin to add the core, think of a farmer's market. Farmers markets remove access to the street for vehicles, but provide tons of access for anyone on a bicycle or on a wheelchair or walking. Farmers markets, if they're run within a street, will also remove all that parking. And yet we see that there's just a tremendous demand for it, and people will come. And so it isn't that the placement of vehicles on that street is so essential, but that there's a capacity when you begin to create beautiful and great places for people to gather. A lot of people will make the transportation decisions that best suit the conditions that you have created. And the challenge that we have is that we have defaulted to making conditions that are best suited to the automobile, which is what results in having so many automobile trips as the default. And when we begin to consider, are there other ways that we can say vehicles are going to be part of our future for a long time, but the clustering of those vehicles and the providing of a parking space right up front of the business that they seek to go to, we've been able to prove that even for small businesses, that's not the most effective use of that space. The capacity of a business improves as it becomes more pedestrianized, as there's more capacity for cyclists to be able to gather there, to dwell there, to spend that time there, as co-located uses become more commonplace. So I showed the development pattern of right in your downtown, you've got so many complementary uses next to it. You can get a number of things accomplished there, whereas the single purpose spaces or the strip mall that has just a limited number of options really does cut out many of the opportunities to make fewer trips a part of your pattern. And so I know, yeah, there's a lot, it's complex. We're not saying, you know, we are not instinctively anti-car in any way, because we say there's a core responsibility for many of our communities to be serviced by the means that they have. But we have also seen, and we can show how many, for example, bus lanes are blocked because of the need to preserve street parking. How many bus lanes are blocked because of the perception that it will slow down traffic. Traffic considered as individuals within their solitary cars, rather than traffic considered broadly, which is, hey, when we move 80 people on a bus, we've actually doubled the capacity of the street without having to invest a dime in the actual physical roadway. A lot of times those calculations are not really surfaced, and that results then in an assumption, well, public transit just doesn't work here because we need people to get around by cars.
Thank you. I think we're going to call it there, since we're a little bit over, and I know you guys have some other meetings to get to. But thank you both for all the great information today, and we will see everybody in a couple of weeks. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was a lot of fun.